Welcome to Southwest Yard and Garden. I'm John White. Today we're going to be touring a retail nursery and look at some of the colorful annuals. We're going to look at some tomato plants. We're also going to look at some containerized ornamental plants, some shrubs and some trees, and identify some of the things as far as picking a good plant out of a retail nursery. So let's come on in. We're in the color house right now, and why we call it a color house is it has all the annual flowers in it, and you can just see the bright colors that are available right now, and it kind of gives you that urge to put something in the ground. Some of the things we want to look at as far as picking an annual is to look at some of the good and bad points of some of the annuals. You like to buy plants that are in color, but that's not really the best way to buy them. The best way to buy them is not in color. Wait for them to come out in color in your yard. So a lot of times the urge is to buy something in color, but we do like to buy them with just have the tight buds on them and not really open yet. So you want to look for that. Also, you want to look at the foliage to see if there's any kind of insect damage, any kind of holes. If there's any signs of any kind of shiny material on the leaves, that might be a sign of an aphid or maybe a snail or a slug or something like that that's been in it. One thing we like to do is pop it out of the container and just slide the container off. Kind of look at the roots. You can see they're real white in color, and there's a lot of them, so that's a sign of a good healthy root system. If the roots are brown or blackened in any way, then that's a sign of possibly a diseased or damaged root system, so you don't want to buy that plant. One of the things we want to look at is the marker that are on plants. These markers tell you a lot. They tell you what the plant is. They give you what its light requirements are, sometimes what its water requirements are, whether it needs shade or sun, what its spacing is, what the height on it's going to be, and the picture of course gives you the color of it. On the back side there's also a description of the plant, so it tells you a little bit more, what the plant is going to do and what it's going to look like. So there's a lot of good information there. If you should have any more questions, contact your nursery retailer and he can give you some of the answers to your questions. That makes you a better and more knowledgeable gardener. The king of the garden is tomatoes, and this is probably the #1 vegetable in home vegetable gardens. Tomatoes just kind of invoke that challenge of producing the first vine-ripened tomato in the neighborhood. And the way to do it is by picking a healthy transplant to start with. We're going to talk about some of the tips as far as picking a good transplant and some of the tomato varieties that are good to use. First thing we want to look at is on a transplant is to make sure that the stem is a nice sturdy stem. We don't want a real spindly plant. That's a sign that may not have had adequate light. So we want a plant that's good and healthy, has a good strong stem on it. You can see this plant has a little bit of a purple coloring on it, and that can be a phosphorus deficiency. As they're in these containers and they're watered pretty heavily, some of the nutrients are leached out. This can easily be taken care of by just adding a little phosphorus fertilizer to it. We also want to look at the foliage to see if there's any kind of holes eaten in it, if there's any kind of bugs flying off it, or bugs that might be stuck to the leaves, aphids, leafhoppers, anything like that, because those can be problems to tomato plants. The other thing we want to look at is the root system on the plant. Again, we want to make sure that it has a white roots on it. That's a sign of good healthy root system. Looks real good, so we want to put it back in the container. The label tells you a lot of information, particularly about variety, because tomato varieties do vary quite a bit. So we want to look at the variety name, and then under the variety name it'll give you several numbers and different letters. And what we're looking at on this one is an AAS, which is an All-American selection. It has VF1 and 2. That means it's verticillium and fusarium resistant strains 1 and 2. And then it has NT, which means nematode resistant and tobacco mosaic resistant. And then it describes the fruit on it and basically a little bit more about the plant. So this is real good information for you. We do like to start with a plant that has some disease resistance in it, just so that the plant is healthier to start with, and will give you that earlier production and better production in your garden. One of your big investments in a landscape is your ornamental trees. These can be sometimes very long-lived in the landscape, a lot of times maybe outlive you. So they are a long-term investment. We want them taken care of properly, so you want to make a good selection because this is a long-term investment. This is a purple leaf plum that we're looking at, but any landscape tree, we kind of want to look at just the overall symmetry of the tree to make sure that it's evenly balanced. A branch that's going to be 3 feet off the ground as a young tree is always going to be 3 feet off the ground. If the tree's 100 years old, the limb is going to be much, much bigger, but it's still going to be 3 feet off the ground. So these kind of limbs you may not want as permanent branches. So what you're going to have to look at is, as this tree grows in height, is establishing some branches later on it as your main scaffold branches. So these that are small, if you're thinking about taking those off, we just want to keep them trimmed out as short little stubs, and that way they will help thicken the trunk and make for a stronger tree. But where we're eventually going to have our scaffold branches is going to be up on the top part of the tree. We're going to look at the base of the tree. A lot of ornamental trees, as well as almost all your fruit trees, are grafted onto a rootstock. And so this bud union, some people call it a dog leg because it has a little bit of a crook. This should actually be out of the ground a little bit. So if that bump or hump is right there at ground level, it probably needs to be raised a little bit out of the ground, because when the tree's budded, it is budded a little bit above ground, and we always want to plant our trees exactly where they were planted in the nursery, where they were dug. So that's very, very important. So again, we want to look for a healthy bottom on it. We want to look for a good straight stem. And if we can follow some of those tips, we should have a good ornamental tree and get it off to a good start for a long-term investment.